That night the air vibrated with a special energy. Margaret's mansion, with its stone walls and illuminated windows, hosted the long-awaited family dinner like every year. Cars were parked all over the driveway, some even on the grass, attesting to the importance of the meeting. In the kitchen, pots and pans clattered and the smell of roast turkey mingled with that of freshly baked bread. Margaret, her grey hair perfectly combed, moved between the hob and the oven, making one last check that everything was perfect. At 68 years old, she retained the precision in her gestures that had made her the undisputed matriarch of the family. Guests arrived in small groups, hugging each other at the entrance and shaking off their coats damp from the autumn drizzle. The children were already running through the hallways and their laughter echoed off the walls full of family photographs. The living room was bustling with conversation. How are the kids, and have you changed your hairstyle? Banal phrases that, however, weave the thread of family relationships. Emily had arrived early with Jake, her husband. At 32, he was still a bit on guard in this house, even after 8 years of marriage. He helped set the table, meticulously arranging the silver cutlery that Margaret only brought for special occasions. Her hands trembled slightly as she manipulated the precious porcelain plates, aware of her mother-in-law's scrutinizing gaze that followed her every movement. "The wine glasses go to the right, dear," Margaret had commented for the third time, her soft voice poorly concealing her anger. Emily smiled, moving the glass silently, telling herself that she wouldn't let those little comments ruin the evening. Jake, busy uncorking bottles of wine with his father in the kitchen, noticed none of these tense exchanges. Emily could hear him laughing at her father's jokes, that frank, warm laugh that had made her fall in love upon their first meeting. She would have liked him to be more present at her side in those moments, but she also understood his desire to enjoy those rare moments with his family. The large oak table, the nerve center of the dining room, extended majestically under the crystal chandelier. Candles along the table cast dancing shadows on the walls, creating a warm atmosphere despite the underlying tension. The cutlery shone softly and the cloth napkins, folded in a fan, waited calmly on the plates. The cousins began to take their places around the table, searching for the place cards Margaret had written. Emily noticed that her mother-in-law had placed it right in front of her, a strategic position that would allow her to keep an eye on her daughter-in-law throughout the meal. She sat gracefully, straightening the burgundy dress she had chosen especially for the occasion. Aunt Louise, Margaret's sister, spoke loudly as usual, recounting her latest holiday in Brittany to anyone who would listen. Her husband nodded mechanically, accustomed to these enthusiastic monologues for 30 years. The youngest cousins, Marie and Thomas, were arguing over the last chair by the window, until their mother intervened with an authoritative shh. The air was saturated with a multitude of smells: Aunt Louise's perfume, a little too present, Uncle Pierre's aftershave, the cooking aromas that escaped through the swing door, and that particular smell of beeswax that Margaret used to take care of your furniture. Emily breathed it all in, silently observing the family dynamic unfolding around her. Jake finally came and sat next to her, placing a comforting hand on her thigh under the table. He leaned toward her and whispered in her ear, "Everything is going to be okay," as if sensing her anxiety. Emily smiled at him, grateful for this small moment of complicity. She knew he understood the complexity of his relationship with his mother, although he often preferred to stay out of the conflict. The dishes began to arrive, carried proudly by Margaret, who orchestrated the service like a conductor. The golden turkey was in the center of the table, surrounded by small glazed vegetables and roast potatoes. The wine flowed generously into the glasses, gradually relaxing the atmosphere. The conversations became lively, intertwined, creating a warm uproar. Emily felt Margaret's gaze rest on her regularly, a constant reminder of her presence. She tried to make light conversation with her table neighbor, Sarah, Jake's cousin, while keeping an eye out for the slightest warning signs of a confrontation. The years had taught her to recognize those moments when her mother-in-law was about to make one of her biting comments, carefully dressed in politeness. The heat in the room gradually increased, the fire in the fireplace crackling happily. Cheeks were rosy from wine and good food, laughter was easier. Even little Arthur, normally so shy, told a joke to his cousins, encouraged by the festive atmosphere. The meal was in full swing when Margaret sat up slightly in her chair, her barely opened glass of wine placed in front of her. Emily knew this gesture by heart, This is how the most tense moments always began. The conversation around the table continued, calmly, but Emily already felt her stomach turn. "Emily, dear," Margaret began, her voice loud enough to attract the attention of everyone at the table. She gently caressed his mouth with the napkin before continuing. "I was wondering if you had time to take care of the bathroom like I asked you before." Silence fell on the table like a lead ruler. The forks stopped midway, the conversations ceased. Even Aunt Louise, who never stopped talking, was left speechless. Emily felt a blush rise to her cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from suppressed anger. She had never received this request. It was purely Margaret's invention, a manipulation she was used to. The cousins exchanged awkward glances, some suddenly pretending to be fascinated by the contents of their plate. Sarah, sitting next to Emily, discreetly touched her arm in support. Jake, for his part, had stiffened in his chair, his gaze darting from his mother to his wife, visibly torn between his filial duty and his role as a husband. The air in the room seemed to have thickened. The fire in the fireplace crackled with an almost disturbing intensity in that heavy silence. Emily could hear her own heart pounding in her ears, but she apparently remained calm, as years of experience dictate. He took a small sip of wine and gave himself a few precious seconds to gather his thoughts. Margaret's eyes never left her, shining with a thinly veiled glint of defiance. It was their usual dance, Margaret creating an awkward situation, waiting for Emily to lose her cool or apologize outright. But tonight was different. Emily felt a new strength within her, perhaps born from the exhaustion of these years of small humiliations. "No, I haven't had the chance to do that yet," he replied in a calm voice, maintaining eye contact with his mother-in-law. He did not add anything more, refusing to justify himself for a task that had never been requested of him. The silence lasted for a few more seconds, electric. Around the table the reactions were varied. Uncle Pierre coughed nervously and looked down at his glass of wine. The younger cousins, sensing the tension but not fully understanding it, shifted in their chairs. Little Marie even knocked over her glass of water, creating an unintentional distraction that her mother quickly overcame. Time seemed to have frozen in the dining room. The candles continued to flicker softly, casting moving shadows on the tense faces of the guests. Margaret set down her glass with calculated slowness, the glass clinking lightly against the embroidered tablecloth. "Oh," he said, lengthening the simple sound as if to give it more weight. "I thought I was clear this morning on the phone." Another lie, since they hadn't spoken for days. Emily felt Jake tense up even more next to her. He knew, as she did, that no call had been made. Emily's hand imperceptibly grabbed her napkin under the table. She could feel the gazes of other family members moving between her and Margaret, like during a particularly tense tennis match. Aunt Louise, in a clumsy attempt to lighten the mood, tried to resume the conversation about her vacation in Brittany, but her voice quickly died down due to the wall of tension that separated the two women. "Margaret," Jake interjected quietly, "I don't remember Mom getting a call this morning." His voice was calm, but Emily could hear the note of reproach hidden in it. It was the first time he had adopted such a clear stance in one of his confrontations. Margaret's face tensed slightly, but she quickly recovered. "Oh, so maybe it was yesterday? The days are a lot the same when you get older." He gave a little laugh that fooled no one. "Anyway, it's just a small task, right? It'll only take a few minutes." Emily felt something inside her break. Not her courage or her determination, but the invisible chains that kept her in this simulation game. The years of derogatory comments, of small public humiliations, of subtle manipulations passed through his mind. He placed his cutlery with studied delicacy, the clinking of metal against porcelain echoing in the silence that had once again settled in. The flames of the candles reflected in her eyes as she raised her head to look at her mother-in-law. The time had come to end this toxic dynamic, but I had to do it with grace. Sarah, still at his side, gave him another encouraging push. Out of the corner of her eye, Emily saw Aunt Louise's approving smile. Maybe she wasn't the only one who had suffered from Margaret's manipulations all these years. Perhaps others were also waiting for someone to finally dare to confront the matriarch. Margaret's face had hardened and her lips formed a thin, pale line. His fingers tapped lightly on the tablecloth, the only visible sign of his growing agitation. The atmosphere in the room had become so thick that it seemed almost palpable. "Well," Margaret said again, her voice growing higher, "maybe you should take care of that now." It was no longer a suggestion, but a thinly veiled order. The tone of his voice startled little Arthur, who dropped his fork with a clang. Emily felt a surge of heat rise inside her, this time not of shame, but of determination. He looked around the table, taking in the familiar faces, desperately trying to avoid eye contact. Only Jake looked at her, his brown eyes filled with a mix of pride and concern. He nodded imperceptibly, silently giving her permission to do what she had to do. "You know, Margaret," Emily began, her voice soft but firm, "I think it's more important to enjoy this time together." He made a gesture that encompassed the table. "You've prepared a wonderful meal, the family is together. It would be a shame to ruin it, right?" A murmur of approval went around the table. Aunt Louise nodded vigorously, almost spilling her wine glass in her enthusiasm. Even Uncle Pierre, usually so discreet, smiled a faint smile of approval. Margaret sat up straight in her chair, like a cobra ready to strike. His eyes glinted dangerously in the flickering candlelight. "I didn't know keeping a house clean was considered ruining something," she replied, her voice dripping with sarcasm. The silence that followed was deafening. The younger cousins watched the scene with wide eyes, instinctively feeling that they were witnessing a crucial moment. Sarah, next to Emily, had moved slightly away from the table, as if to physically protect herself from the growing tension. Emily took a deep breath and smelled the familiar aroma of roast turkey and scented candles. These smells that normally evoked comfort and family, now seemed strangely overwhelming. She placed her hands on the table, a gesture that betrayed her desire to remain anchored in the present moment. "That's not what I said, Margaret, and you know it very well," he replied calmly. His voice didn't shake, even though his heart was racing. "I'm just suggesting that some moments deserve our full attention. This family reunion is one of them." Suddenly, the fire in the fireplace crackled, surprising several guests. Margaret raised the napkin to her lips, a gesture that failed to conceal her growing displeasure. Jake had placed his hand on Emily's under the table, squeezing it gently to support her. "My dear," Margaret continued, using the term of endearment as a weapon, "I understand that you want to enjoy the evening. But you see, in this house we have certain standards to uphold." He emphasized this last word as if it contained the full weight of his judgment. Emily felt something shift inside her. Years of passive-aggressive comments, thinly veiled criticism, and orders disguised as suggestions flooded his mind. He sat up slightly, his back straight against the back of the chair. "Rules are important," he agreed, his calm voice contrasting with the storm raging inside him. "Just like mutual respect." He paused, letting his words echo through the room. "And I think we both deserve it, don't we?" A small hiccup of surprise escaped Aunt Louise's mouth, who clumsily tried to turn it into a cough. The cousins exchanged furtive glances, some poorly concealing their admiration for this polite but firm rebellion. Margaret paled slightly and tightened her fingers on her wine glass. The glass made a slight tinkle that seemed to resonate in the tense silence of the dining room. The shadows cast by the candles danced across his face, accentuating the hard lines that had formed there. "Respect," he repeated slowly, as if savoring each syllable, "is earned by our actions, Emily. By our ability to understand and meet the expectations of those who welcome us under their roof." Emily felt Jake tense beside her. She knew he was torn between his love for her and respect for his mother. But this time she couldn't let him intervene. It was his fight, one he should have fought a long time ago. "You're right," he replied, surprising everyone, including Margaret. "Actions matter. That is why I choose to act with dignity tonight, honoring this meal that you have prepared with such care, rather than giving in to unnecessary provocations." A stunned silence fell over the table. Margaret's face turned several shades of red before taking on a disturbing pallor. He put down his glass with such force that a few drops of wine splashed on the immaculate tablecloth, forming small violet stains that seemed to mock his need for perfection. "Provocations?" His voice trembled slightly. "Is this how you interpret my attempts to teach you manners?" He looked around the table, obviously seeking support among the guests. But for the first time no one came to his aid. Even Uncle Pierre, his usual ally, suddenly seemed fascinated by the drawings on his plate. Emily felt a strange sense of calm come over her. It was as if all those years of tension had finally come to a head, and now that he was facing it, the fear had dissipated. "Good manners," he said quietly, "also include respecting the dignity of others, Margaret." Jake cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable. "Mom," he started, but Emily put a hand on his arm and gently stopped him. This was her moment and she had to face it alone. "It's not about manners," Emily continued, her voice soft but firm. "It's about power, right? Control?" He paused, watching the reactions around the table. The younger cousins looked at her with a mixture of amazement and admiration, while the adults seemed to hold their breath. Sarah, sitting next to him, gave him an encouraging push. Aunt Louise's eyes were shining, as if she were witnessing the outcome of a particularly captivating film. The fire in the fireplace crackled softly, the only sound in the tense silence that had fallen. Margaret opened her mouth and then closed it, visibly unsettled by this direct but respectful confrontation. Her hands, normally so sure, trembled slightly as she readjusted the napkin in her lap. For the first time since Emily had known her, she seemed unsure of how to react. "I won't allow it," Margaret began, but her voice lacked its usual conviction. She paused, searching for words, an unusual situation for a woman who had always known exactly what to say to maintain her authority. Emily took this opportunity to continue, keeping her voice calm and measured. "You know, Margaret, I admire you very much. You have raised a wonderful family, you maintain these traditions that unite us all." He gestured around the beautifully set table. "But sometimes love and respect have to go both ways." A murmur of approval went around the table. Little Marie, 8 years old, nodded vigorously, although she probably did not understand all the subtleties of the situation. His innocent approval brought a few discreet smiles around the table. Margaret seemed to have shrunk in her chair, her usual confidence visibly crumbling. His eyes scanned the table, noticing perhaps for the first time the furtive glances, the tense expressions, the signs of an unease that had lasted for years. He cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure. "I'm just upholding the standards that have always made this family proud." But her voice lacked conviction, as if she herself was beginning to doubt his motives. Emily leaned forward slightly, making direct eye contact with her mother-in-law. "Standards can change, Margaret. Families can too. What shouldn't change is the respect and love we have for each other." Jake squeezed her hand gently under the table and Emily felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. He had always been caught in the crossfire and she knew how difficult this situation must have been for him as well. The silence that followed was different from the previous ones. It was no longer filled with tension, but rather with a kind of expectation, as if the entire family was holding its breath, waiting to see how this new dynamic would take hold. Margaret stood up abruptly from the table and her chair scraped the floor with a noise that made everyone flinch. "I'm going to order dessert," he announced with a voice that betrayed his excitement. Without looking back, he disappeared into the kitchen, leaving a heavy silence behind him. Conversations resumed slowly, like a stream flowing again after a dam. Aunt Louise was the first to speak, commenting with somewhat forced enthusiasm on the quality of the roast. The other guests hurried to follow her, relieved to have a neutral topic of conversation. Emily remained silent, staring at the kitchen door. He knew Margaret well enough to know that this hasty departure was not insignificant. Beside him, Jake shook his hand. "Do you want me to go?" he whispered, but Emily shook her head. She knew it was up to her to leave. "I'll be back," he said softly, standing up carefully. Sarah gave him a small encouraging smile as she walked around the table. The noise of conversation diminished as he approached the kitchen, as if the entire family were holding their breath. Opening the swinging door, Emily was greeted by the unmistakable sound of someone moving with too much energy. Margaret was standing at the sink, furiously scrubbing an already spotless frying pan. His shoulders were tense and Emily could see he was trying to contain his emotions. The kitchen was warm and still fragrant with the smells of food. The dishwasher hummed quietly in the corner and, on the counter, the apple pie was waiting to be served, its golden crust glistening in the bright neon light. Emily stood at the door for a moment, watching her mother-in-law continue scrubbing the pan as if her life depended on it. "Can I help you?" he suggested softly, taking a step towards the kitchen. Margaret jumped slightly, but did not turn around. His hands paused for a moment under the flowing water, then resumed their frantic movement. "I suppose you came to savor your victory," Margaret replied, her trembling voice betraying an emotion Emily had never heard from her before. It was no longer the confident voice of the matriarch, but that of a wounded and perhaps a little lost woman. Emily slowly approached the sink and picked up a cloth as she walked. Without a word, she stood next to Margaret, ready to dry the dishes. The only sound in the kitchen was that of running water and the dishwasher continuing its cycle, indifferent to the unfolding drama. "It's not about winning," Emily finally said, her voice soft but firm. He picked up the frying pan that Margaret had finally dropped and began to methodically clean it. "I came because I think it's time for you and me to really talk." Margaret turned off the water abruptly and leaned against the sink as if her legs could no longer support her. His hands, normally so sure, trembled slightly. "Talk about what?" he asked, but his usually defensive tone seemed to have lost its strength. "On our part," Emily replied simply. "About this family. About why you feel the need to control everything, down to the smallest details." She put down the frying pan and turned to her mother-in-law. "About why you find it so hard to trust me." There was silence, disturbed only by the muffled sounds of conversations that reached them from the dining room. Margaret kept looking at the empty sink, as if there she might find the answers to questions she had never dared to ask. "You don't understand," he began, but his voice broke. He took a deep breath before continuing. "This house, this family, it's all I have. I spent my life building this, maintaining a certain standard. And then you came along, with your different ideas, your way of doing things." Emily waited patiently for Margaret to find the words, resisting the urge to fill the silence. In the dining room, someone laughed, the sound muffled through the door. "You changed the dynamic," Margaret continued, finally turning to Emily. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Jake listens to you more than he listens to me. The kids love you. You do things differently and it works. And I feel more and more worthless." Emily felt her heart sink at this unexpected confession. For the first time, he saw past Margaret's mask of perfection and saw the vulnerability beneath. She took another cloth and handed it to her mother-in-law, a simple gesture but one that nevertheless seemed loaded with meaning. "You're not useless, Margaret," he said quietly. "This family wouldn't survive without you. Look what you've created." He made a gesture encompassing the impeccable kitchen, the dishes prepared with care. "No one questions that." Margaret took the cloth mechanically, turning it in her hands. "I see the way everyone looks at you," he whispered. "Like you're a breath of fresh air. I'm just the uptight old lady who sticks to her ways." From the dining room came the clinking of glasses, followed by childish laughter. Life continued on the other side of the door, ignoring the crucial moment unfolding in the kitchen. "You know," Emily began, pulling 2 mugs out of a cabinet, "when I first met Jake, what impressed me most was the way he talked about his family, especially you." He put the kettle on and the familiar purring filled the silence. "She was telling me how you had handled raising 3 children alone after their father left. How you had never missed a single end-of-year show, not a single parent-teacher meeting." Margaret blinked, surprised. "Did he tell you about that?" "Of course," Emily smiled as she took out the tea bags. He suddenly realized that he knew by heart the location of everything in this kitchen. "He's proud of you, you know? We all are. It's just, sometimes being strong doesn't mean having to control everything." Margaret slowly sat down in one of the kitchen chairs, as if her legs could no longer support her. Emily prepared the tea in silence, giving her mother-in-law time to absorb her words. The comforting smell of Earl Grey began to fill the kitchen. "I always thought," Margaret paused, searching for words. "I always thought that if I let go of my control a little, everything would fall apart. That if I wasn't perfect, everyone would see how good I am." She didn't finish the sentence, but Emily understood. "Vulnerable," he suggested softly, placing a steaming mug in front of Margaret. "Human." He sat across from her and blew on his own tea. "You know, That's what unites us all. Our imperfections, our doubts. Another laugh came from the dining room, followed by little Marie's characteristic noise when she got too excited. Margaret smiled despite herself. "I remember when Jake was little," he said suddenly, his fingers playing with the handle of his mug. "He made the exact same noise when he was happy. Kind of like an excited little bird." His face softened at the memory. "I was very afraid of doing it wrong. Of not being good enough." Emily approached the table and gently placed her hand on Margaret's. "You've done an extraordinary job. Jake is a wonderful man, and it's because of you. But you know what? He's not perfect either, and that's what makes him so endearing." Margaret looked at their joined hands and a tear finally rolled down her cheek. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "For tonight, for all the other times. I don't know how else to do it." "We can learn," Emily responded with an encouraging smile. "Together. This family is big enough for both of us, don't you think? With our different ways of doing things." When Emily and Margaret returned to the dining room, something had changed. It wasn't just the way they walked side by side, or the slight smile that floated on Margaret's lips. It was something deeper, a tension that had dissipated, giving way to a lighter atmosphere. Jake was the first to notice. Her eyes widened slightly as she saw her mother and wife enter together, Margaret carrying the apple pie while Emily followed with the crème fraîche. There was a natural synchronization to their movements, as if they had done it hundreds of times. "Sorry for the wait," Margaret announced in a voice that had lost its usual sharpness. "Emily helped me prepare dessert." It wasn't entirely true, but everyone at the table understood that those words meant more than just helping in the kitchen. Aunt Louise, who had never known how to keep her thoughts to herself, blurted out, "Well, it's about time," which made the whole table laugh. Even Margaret smiled and cut the cake into equal parts with her characteristic precision. Emily sat back down next to Jake, who discreetly shook her hand under the table. "Everything's fine?" he whispered, a note of concern in his voice. She nodded and watched Margaret distribute the plates with a new, almost relaxed grace. "You know, Emily," Margaret said suddenly, handing her a plate, "this cake is my grandmother's recipe. Maybe one day I could teach it to you." His voice was hesitant, as if he were testing new territory, but sincere. A surprised silence settled around the table. Everyone knew that the apple pie recipe was Margaret's most precious treasure. She had always refused to share it, even with her own daughters. "I'd like to," Emily replied softly, including the scope of this offer. Sarah's eyes darted away in surprise and Aunt Louise nearly choked on her sip of wine. The evening then took a different turn. Conversations became more natural, more authentic. Margaret, for the first time in years, even allowed herself to laugh openly at one of Uncle Pierre's jokes, a crystal-clear sound that surprised everyone with its spontaneity. Little Marie, embarked on this new environment, left her chair to come sit on her grandmother's lap, something she had never dared to do before. Instead of scolding her for her table manners, Margaret simply wrapped her in her arms, breathing in the scent of her hair with a peaceful smile. "Grandma," Marie asked in her flute voice, "can you teach me how to make apple pie too?" He glanced at Emily, as if to make sure she wouldn't get angry at sharing that privilege. Margaret exchanged a look with Emily before answering. "Of course, honey. It'll be our project, the three of us. What do you say?" His voice trembled slightly, but his eyes shone with a new brilliance. Jake watched the scene in amazement, as if discovering a new side to his family. "I don't remember the last time we spent such a pleasant evening," Emily whispered, strong enough for his mother to hear him. "Maybe because it is the first time we really are ourselves," Margaret replied, surprising everyone for his honesty. He distractedly stroked Mary's hair, with a lost look. "I spent so much time trying to maintain an image of perfection. I had forgotten the essential." Aunt Louise raised her glass. "To the essential, then," he proceeded with his characteristic enthusiasm. Everyone followed their example, even children with their fruit juice glasses. The evening was coming to an end, but nobody seemed in a hurry to leave. Naturally, the family moved to the living room, where the fire of the fireplace created a warm atmosphere. The children drowned in the cozy corners and their faces reflected the peace that had been installed in the house. Margaret had abandoned his shoes and his feet were comfortably involved under her in her favorite chair. It was a small gesture, but for those who met him, he was revolutionary. Margaret Diavant would never have sacrificed elegance for comfort, even at the end of the evening. "You remember," he suddenly began, "from the moment Jake tried to make a birthday cake for Emily?" She already laughed when telling the story, an authentic laugh that had nothing to do with her usual polished laugh. Jake theatrical gime, but also smiled. "Mom, you had promised to never mention this incident." "Oh, but I want to hear that," Sarah exclaimed, straightening in his chair. The other family members leaned forward, intrigued by this new version of Margaret that shared shameful stories about his son. "He was so determined to do something special," Margaret continued, with his eyes shining with mischief. "A whole day spent in my kitchen, rejecting all help. When I finally had the right to enter." He stopped, laughing more. "There was a flower everywhere. On the roof. I still wonder how he managed to put flour on the roof." Emily snuggled against Jake, laughing with others. "The cake was delicious, yes," she defended her husband. "My dear," Aunt Louise intervened, "you can be the only one in the world that this feed cake has found." It was closer to concrete than the dough. The stories were now naturally followed, each one making their contribution to this tapestry of family memories. Uncle Pierre, generally so reserved, even told how he had met his wife, a story that no one had heard before. Little Marie fell asleep on the carpet in front of the fireplace, with her head resting on a cushion. Margaret looked at her tenderly, and for the first time at night, he did not comment on the fact that we did not sleep on the ground in a civilized house. "You know," he said gently, his gaze passed from Marie to Emily, then to the rest of the family, "I spent so many years trying to create the perfect family that I had forgotten that we were already." A moved silence welcomed these words. Jake got up, went to get the last bottles of wine and filled the glasses. "I think a toast is essential," he said, his slightly strident voice of emotion. "For the family," he began, raising his glass. "To her imperfections that make her perfect. For Mom, who taught us strength." He looked at Margaret with love. "For Emily, who taught us that we could be much in another way." His gaze posed on his wife. "And for all of us, that we finally learn to accept ourselves as we are." The glasses were gently embedded in the sifted light of the living room. Outside, the night had fallen for a long time, wrapping the house in its dark coat. But inside, the heat that reigned was no longer only that of fire in the fireplace. Margaret rose in turn, a small possibility of emotion. "I would also like to say something," he said, his voice softer than ever. "Thank you. For your patience with me. For having shown me that there are other ways to love." She looked at Emily directly. "And thanks, love, for not surrendering." The night ended naturally, without hurry. The families left one by one, taking with it not only the remains of the apple cake that Margaret had distributed generously, but also the memory of a night that had marked a new beginning. While Jake helped Marie to sleep to put her coat, Margaret took Emily in her arms, a real hug, not one of these polished hugs she generally gave. "Return soon," he whispered. "We have a bitter recipe to share."